Hail and well met, traveler. Thank you for joining me today for this week's video, part 2 of at least a trilogy on Dungeons & Dragons. If you end up enjoying this video, consider a like, comment, subscribe, and turning on notifications so that the algorithmic dungeon master of YouTube recognizes my work out here. If you'd like to support my work, head on over to Patreon, where you can support me for as little as 1 gold piece per month. Alternatively, head on over to cnp-productions.com/store if you'd like to pick yourself up a shirt or sticker. The shirts come in sizes from extra small to 2XL in black, navy, gray, and red, while the stickers come in 3, 4, and 5.5 inch sizes. There's a new shirt and sticker design released for each week's video, and the designs are often up several days in advance, so check back regularly. Now, without further ado, let's get into it. Okay, so quick note, let's get some organizational stuff out of the way. Last week, we talked about the white box, or the original release of D&D. For simplicity, I will be calling that release box as either OD&D or Original D&D or 0E or 0 Edition, as it's often referred to as the prototype for the modern D&D edition system. Also, I'll be referring to the other editions of D&D by their acronym or their edition number, as it's colloquially far more common to do so. Yeah, that's probably the only notes I've got. Let's get into it. Let's go. Come on. In 1977, TSR would release Basic D&D as the first in a two-pronged strategy for the game's further development, with Advanced D&D coming out later that same year. As they were marketed, BD&D was designed for people entirely new to the idea of tabletop roleplay and was specifically written to be a simplification of the OD&D rules and mechanics. As it was written, BD&D would direct players and dungeon masters who had exhausted their options in the basic set to switch over to the more open and complex rule system of AD&D. Sounds simple, sounds unified, but it was anything but. Throughout the development of Dungeons & Dragons, there's always been some contention between the creative visions of the different development teams or their individual members, and this is definitely not different in the case of AD&D and BD&D. You see, Gary Gygax was nothing if not concise and complex in his descriptions, rules, and game mechanics, and that can be seen in every game he's produced or helped to create, not just in D&D. However, there was another faction that believed D&D should be made simple for the average consumer, someone who's never heard of miniatures wargaming, never sat down at a game table, or only ever played board games like Monopoly or card games like Uno. The idea was that they should be able to quickly grasp the rules of D&D and jump in whenever they felt like it. Now, Gygax wholeheartedly disagreed with this idea. He saw a clear and deep divide between classic board gaming or card games and the gameplay mechanics of a tabletop RPG or war games. As such, he believed that if you were willing to try to jump into the TTRPG scene, you should expect rules to become more complex and situational. So, while generationally revising OD&D as new print editions continued to sell like hotcakes, John Eric Holmes would be brought on to help create a new simplified game. Holmes much preferred a simplified codified rule system and a lighter tone with more room for improvised situations and interactions. He wanted the players to treat the rules more like guidelines than actual hard and fast requirements. We see a simple pricing system, simple gear list, encumbrance rules, experience points, and even one of the first uses of the character alignment system of lawful and chaotic, good and evil, with the center being neutrality. In 1981, Holmes would bring on Tom Moldvay to help further simplify these rules and make them even more novice-friendly, and David Zeb Cook would create the first expansions under the Expert Set title, allowing players to use the BD&D rules beyond early level campaigns. In 1983, the second revision of BD&D would be released and would include one of the most famous early modules, the Keep on the Borderlands. Now, this set is commonly referred to today as the Red Box and was one of the most well-sold sets of the era. The Red Box would be the way that so many different people would get into playing this game, including my dad, who had been a fan of the game since he was in high school. Oh, by the way, Dad, if you are watching this, we do still need to schedule our next game. But what about AD&D? What happened there? Well, AD&D would be the favorite child of Gygax and crew and would include many of the ideas and systems still used in the game today. It was supported with far more supplements and expansions than BD&D would ever receive and would be responsible for the addition system commonly used today. While BD&D would just release new revisions under the same title with no edition marker, AD&D would release its second edition as title in 1989, and after over a decade of using 1E. Now, 1E was designed to create a tighter, more structured system than the relatively loose framework of 0E, and was closer to the game Gygax had envisioned in the first place. Between 1977 and 1979, 3 books, now referred to as the core rule books, which today are released with every version of the game, would be released twice, once for BD&D and once for AD&D. For over a decade, we would have 2 versions of the Player's Handbook, the Dungeon Master's Guide, and the Monster Manual, and with the later edition of the Unearthed Arcana book, this would make 4 different books with 2 different versions being released for a combined decade of printing. To add confusion, 0E would continue to be printed until 1979, so we had at least 3 different versions of the game existing at the same time, all of which were being played and used different rule systems and game mechanics. However complex this may have seemed, it worked for 1E, and it would be one of the most popular systems released. It was through AD&D 1E that we got Ravenloft, Dragonlance, a revised Greyhawk, and even the Forgotten Realms as the official main setting. It was widely popular, but that popularity came with media scrutiny and public outcry against certain elements of the game, including their reference to demons, devils, and more sexually suggestive content. In 1989, AD&D 2E would be released, and while it became the standard for the next decade of play, it would remove almost any reference to the previously mentioned elements. Now, that wouldn't really stop people from adapting older modules, but it would discourage some. But why? Why would they find pushback, and why would they cave to the opinions of people completely uninvolved in the publication or play? The idea of a moral panic has been around for as long as there has been any one group that thinks another group is lesser than them. Now, whether those groups be racial, religious, national, or what have you, persecution has been an effective tool to root one out of the social and cultural fabric of the other. One thing misunderstood is that it goes both ways. A minority in one place is a majority somewhere else, and vice versa. As such, persecution can affect either equally. In the United States, one very effective way historically to get the nation to unite against something or someone that has been vilified was to accuse the person of being a communist and, through McCarthyism, also a Satanist. To attack the economic and religious foundations of the nation used to be one of the greatest ways to make someone wary of the persecuted. This really is no different in the case of Dungeons & Dragons. In 1980, a book titled Michelle Remembers, written by Michelle Smith and her husband, the psychiatrist Lawrence Pasder, would be published as an autobiography. This book would allege that McMartin Preschool was not only committing child abuse, but that the child abuse was specifically related to satanic ritual abuse, or SRA. While the book would go on to be discredited, it would not dissuade social workers and others from proving cases using the book as a framework for numerous allegations. Pasder would gain immense success from this book and would tour the nation giving lectures on SRA and how to combat it in law enforcement, and would even be a lead consultant in over 1,000 SRA cases by 1990. Now, in 1979, 16-year-old James Dallas Egbert would attempt suicide in the utility tunnels under Michigan State University, then went missing for a month. His parents would hire private investigator William Deere, who discovered James played D&D and heard the rumor that some kids would go down to the steam tunnels to LARP it sometimes. Now, while James attempted suicide in the tunnels and his later suicide by self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head had zero connection whatsoever to D&D, rather in fact being related to clinical depression, it would not stop people like Rona Jaffe from writing Mazes and Monsters in 1981, a fiction novel placing all the blame on the Egbert case on D&D, or Patricia Pulling, the anti-occult campaigner from creating Bad, also known as Bothered About Dungeons and Dragons. Mazes and Monsters would be adapted into a made-for-TV movie starring Tom Hanks in 1982 under the same title, with Hanks playing the Egbert allegory. Similarly, Jack T. Chick would create one of his most famous Chick tracks titled Dark Dungeons, wherein he would portray D&D as being a recruiting tool for witches' covens and satanic cults. That, too, would produce its own movie under the same title. If somehow you haven't heard of it or watched the JonTron video, what are you doing? I mean, seriously, watch that, then come back here to finish this.
Hey, look! A Dungeons and Dragons ride! Wow, neat!
Give me a break.
I don't like this!
Whoa! What's happening?
Whoa! Where are we?
Look out!
Fear not, ranger. Barbarian, magician, thief, cavalier, and acrobat.
Who was that?
That was Venger, the force of evil. I am Dungeon Master, your guide in the realm of Dungeons and Dragons.
Despite the successes of 1E and 2E, TSR would be near bankrupt by the late 90s, and having 3 or 4 versions of the game being supported and released at the same time was certainly no help. Too many eggs and too many baskets and all that. In 1997, Wizards of the Coast, the company behind the card game giant Magic the Gathering, would buy out TSR and begin developing a new edition designed to merge BD&D and AD&D into one unified edition. In 2000, Wizards would release Dungeons & Dragons 3rd Edition, and the world would absolutely erupt. 3E and the later 3.5E, a mostly minor revision, would be considered possibly the greatest version of the game to be released. To this day, it is a fan favorite, often played as an alternative to 5E and Pathfinder. 3E would be responsible for unifying the D20 system as the backbone of the game. The rules were completely internally consistent, being less restrictive and allowing for player input and flexibility. It reintroduced skills and feats as core mechanics that added an extra level of character customization. Most of all, encounter actions and resolutions were streamlined. Now, in 2005, even with the success of 3E, Wizards would begin working on 4E after some feedback from a, retrospectively, very vocal minority of their customers. Now, much of the complaints revolved around wanting a faster-paced game that was more intuitive and, quote, a better play experience, whatever that's supposed to mean. On August 7th, 2007, D&D 4E would be announced at Gen Con, and the first 3 books would be released on June 6th the following year. While it was initially a success, it would end up being far less successful as a whole. A common complaint about 4E would be that it was, quote, too video gamey, and restructured much of the greatness of 3 simply to accommodate newcomers who would equate D&D gameplay to RPG video games. It was certainly simpler, but simplified to the point that it felt too repetitive and grindy. Certainly far more than people had expected. Now, today, we have 5th edition, which is possibly the most successful version of the game to have ever existed. 5th edition was released in late 2014, but would not gain any real traction until 2015. In 2017, Wizards had reported that Dungeons & Dragons had, quote, the most number of players in history, 12 to 15 million in North America alone. Through the last 6 years, with the rise of live gameplay, people across the world have been exposed to the game through groups like Critical Role and celebrities like Joe Manganiello, Vin Diesel, Deborah Ann Wall, and Stephen Colbert expressing their love for this game. This game is bigger than ever and certainly doesn't look like it's going to stop. But what about me? What are my thoughts and experiences with this game? Well, I've known about the game for most of my life. My dad was absolutely engrossed when he was my age and would only stop playing close to around the time he met my mother, but never lost interest. I'd played a few one-shots as a kid, and my imagination would run wild inventing new characters, but I was never invested in the game until somewhere between 1.5 and 2 years ago. Though I can't remember who proposed the idea first, my friend Nathan would be my DM for a Curse of Strahd campaign, and it ran for about 10 weeks before it would fall through. While I never lost contact with Nathan, I stopped hanging out with the rest of the group that played the game, and it kind of all just fell apart. I always craved it though, and decided about 6 months ago to run my own. As a personal title, it's called Nightlife in Noctis, which is a homebrew campaign that entirely takes place in one large city, similarly to how Waterdeep Dragon Heist would run. It's a mixture of different influences, but mostly it's a noir, gothic city-state where my players are currently embroiled in trying to take down one of the city's organized criminal societies, the Pugilist Court. They're close to what might be the final showdown between them and the leader of the court, Stonehands, and stuff is really heating up. They're embroiled, they're engrossed, and I am loving the story that we're crafting together. It's amazing, and it's one of the ways I've been able to stay in contact with my friends from back in California, and I would not change it for the world. Alright, thank you so much for watching this week's video. There's going to be at least one more week of D&D, and maybe more depending on the rest of the research I've got here. Now, if you enjoyed this show, leave a like, comment, subscribe, and make sure to turn on notifications so that the YouTube algorithm recognizes my work. If you'd like to support my work, head on over to Patreon, where you can support me for as little as 1 gold piece per month. Alternatively, head on over to cnp-productions.com/store if you'd like to pick yourself up a shirt or sticker. Now, the shirts come in sizes from extra small to 2XL, in black, navy, gray, and red, while the stickers come in 3, 4, and 5.5 inch sizes. There's a new shirt and sticker design released for each week's video, and the designs are often up several days in advance, so check back regularly. Next week, we dive into the relationships between the different people and creative teams throughout the history of D&D, and hopefully get a better understanding of how the game got to where it is today. I'll see you then. Same bat time, same bat channel.